In Daniel 4 and verse 25, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that the lesson he needed to learn was that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. Is that still true? And what does it mean for us as people who trust in God?
This is Prove All Things, a podcast where we test everything so that we can hold fast to what is good and abstain from what is evil.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. It's not very much of a secret that the world is in chaos right now, and we see that especially here in America. And there are just tons of things going on related to the virus. There are tons of things going on related to the political scene. There are things related to racism, and just I don't really have to rehearse all of those things that are going on. You know them very well. But in some, the question really kind of comes up: has God lost control, or is God even still aware of what's going on? And some people might look at the chaotic nature of things and think God has just sat back, God has forgotten, God is no longer doing anything. But if God is still in control, then how does that shape our thinking? You know, right now we are in a position where I think what we're wanting to do is, as Americans, we're seeing some of our liberties slip away. We're seeing some of our rights brought into maybe danger as to where we're not going to be able to hold on to some of these rights anymore. So all that being said, if God is still in control, then how does that shape my thinking towards defending my rights? How does that shape my thinking towards taking some of these stands against some of the things that are going on? Guys, what do we make of it? First of all, is God still in control? Is God still ruling in men's affairs? And if so, what do we do with that information?
Well, when you think about the context of the book of Daniel, I think people reading the book of Daniel would have had exactly the same questions that we have now about whether or not God was still in control. So I think we think of this as a modern question, as a question that only affects 20th or 21st century people. Daniel is a book, I think, that is at least in part written to address the question, is God still in control? And throughout the book, we learn God still rules in the kingdoms of men. And I think the reason sometimes we think that maybe God doesn't rule in the same way is because we think that in the ancient world, maybe it was somehow more obvious that God was intervening in history. But there were people on the ground, and historians now looking back explain the events as part of the natural flow of history. And yet what the biblical writers show us all the way through is that even though there is the kind of going back and forth of nations and empires and leadership coming into power, that God was in control of all of that. And that the people of Israel and Judah thought that somehow they could, by their own power, using their own means, that they could somehow thwart what was coming, that they could change the outcome. And, you know, we read over and over about them trying to make alliances with other nations, and God saying, this is what's coming, through the prophet saying, this is what's coming. And you're not going to be able to change it because I still rule in the kingdoms of men. And yet maybe it wasn't that apparent on the ground that that's exactly what was going on.
So when we look in Scripture, it's very clear that the Bible is telling us that in these times past, God was in control,
Yep.
And yet it didn't, to the human eye, would not appear necessarily that God's in control. So then if we look at today and we say, wait a minute, to the human eye, it doesn't appear that God's in control, we would have reason to believe that if that's the way that he operated in the past, that's the way he's still operating today.
That's right. And even under the New Testament, in the days of the Roman Empire, when here you have an empire like the previous empires that are hostile to God's people, and Paul is still able to say in Romans 13 that the governing authorities are ordained by God. And Tad, we were talking about this a little bit before, whether that means he's putting the specific people in those offices or not, that might be a different question. But the order of government is installed by God. God put that there, and he put it there for in order to keep the reins on this fallen world. And so government is there put in a place as a manager, as a steward of the world in which we live.
Yeah, we talked about, I think, the message of Habakkuk in a podcast, and Habakkuk chose a nation as an instrument of justice, that Habakkuk, someone who really seemed to trust God, didn't understand when it was first revealed to him. It didn't understand. So if we look around and we say, well, I don't know how God's working in that. Well, that doesn't mean that he's not. It doesn't contradict these other statements. And I just want to read maybe one passage from Acts 17. I hope I don't read too much into this. But Paul says to these Gentiles, to this mix of people, there on Mars Hill in Acts 17, he says, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. God is affecting history. I think, maybe it's Doy Moyer who is sometimes, maybe that's where I got the idea, where Paul is describing God here as the God of history, who affects things, and everything that he does is about, helping people to come closer to him and find him. So if we don't believe that's how God's working today, that's a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
I mean, to think that it all depends on me and the faithfulness of my brethren who are near to me, that we're going to take the stand for God. No, we have things that God wants us to do, but God's doing what he's doing. And even if we don't understand how it's going to work out for good, God has been consistent in making things work out for good.
Yeah, so maybe bringing kind of these ideas together that we've talked about thus far is, yes, God's still in control. Well, then what's my responsibility in that? You were talking about defending liberties or rights or being an agent of change in some way or whatever, however you want to term that. What's my responsibility? And I guess at its simplest form, what we should say is, if God is in control, which I think the Bible would leave every indication that he's absolutely still in control, then it should make me want to be pleasing to him. Acts 17, that we should seek the Lord, that we should seek God and grope for him that we might find him. So as we view what's taking place, all of these things, and we have our confidence, well, this is exactly the way history has unfolded in the past when God was in control. God's still in control. But what do I need to do? I need to seek the Lord. I need to make sure that I'm pleasing to him. So what does that look like on these different issues? What does it look like to be pleasing to him when it comes to the government making laws that maybe I feel are restrictive to my liberties? Or what does it look like as I deal with people who hold a very different position than me? How do I please God in those situations?
Yeah. And so, we'll come back to 1 Timothy 2, I think, some bit, but the idea there that we should be praying for our leaders so that they would provide a peaceful and tranquil life, that we would be able to please God. And I think that is important, because short of that, I need to be, God says, I think 1 Timothy 2 is an indication that God's still in control, because he calls us to pray to him in order to order things. So if 1 Timothy 2 still has application to us, which I believe that it does, then that means that God still rules and that prayer is effective, because God does in fact affect the way the world goes.
Yeah. So maybe I think one thing that helps us is if we have the right expectation as to what government is supposed to accomplish. And of course, we've got these passages like you mentioned here in Romans chapter 13, where God tells us, well, what is the purpose of government? And I think maybe sometimes we have a wrong expectation, or we're just kind of thinking along the wrong lines. Like, if I'm expecting the government to make every decision based on the same principles of morality that I'm operating with, then I'm expecting the wrong thing. But I do think it is reasonable to expect them, based on 1 Timothy chapter 2, to allow me to live a quiet, peaceful life, even exercising my Christianity. But here's the thing that kind of stands out to me is we're thinking about defending our rights and standing for this, and we're worried about the liberties that we're losing. It seems to me sometimes, even among Christians, or especially among Christians, what we're fighting for is we're fighting way more passionate for something that pertains to my American citizenship than my heavenly citizenship. And I think what the entire Bible would point to is that one is much more important than the other. And I see so many Christians that are focused on the loss of liberty, the loss of right. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't worry at all about those things, but that's just not what that's not what I need to be passionate about. If I'm going to be passionate about anything, especially a citizenship, it's not the American citizenship, it's the it's the heavenly citizenship, and there's a lot of different areas we might go with this. But I think sometimes what we're so passionate about my rights and my liberties is we overlook some really important Christian principles, like, just thinking about wearing masks. And that's just, unfortunately, that's the topic of the day. And there are a lot of people who are just adamant that government can't tell me what to do. I'm not going to do that. Or what are we overlooking when we take this strong stance against something like a mask?
I think a lot. One thing is that we might say government does have the right to tell us to do things like that. It's easy to talk about Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 and other passages that have to do with our submission to the government when they are telling us to do exactly what we wanted to do anyway. It's a challenge when they're telling us to do things that maybe we don't want to do. And I think the reason that we wanted to talk about some of this in light of the lesson that God still rules in the kingdoms of men is because a lot of people view this wearing of masks as the start down a slippery slope of, losing all of our rights. Today it's masks, tomorrow it's our Bibles, or whatever. But if God still rules in the kingdoms of men, then we can submit and obey the governing authorities, inasmuch as they're not telling us to do something that's in violation of God's will. We can submit and trust that God's going to take care of us. Now, that doesn't mean that it won't be a taking away of our liberties. It doesn't mean that it won't be a slippery slope. It does mean that God still rules in the kingdoms of men, and it's not our job to be the kind of defenders of rights and liberties for the whole earth, because God is the one who has ordained government and put it in its place, and he's told us over and over in his word that our responsibility is to obey. And so Christians are going to be the best citizens in any government, not because they always agree, but because they serve a God who has ordained those governments and has told them that they need to submit. And now is the time to apply those principles, if there ever was a time. And it may get worse. We may have to apply it in even more difficult ways. But we can't just talk about it when it's easy and then say, no, we're going to have a new revolution when it's difficult. That's not how this works.
Yeah. So the government doesn't have the right. Does the government have the right to tell me how fast I can drive? Does the government have the right to tell me that I cannot drive without a license? All these things are changes that the government has implemented for various reasons. And if I understand correctly, speed limits were first, implemented because of the gas shortage, but then they stuck around because they realized the number of traffic fatalities has, decreased drastically. So, what Christian principle am I being asked to give up when the government says wear a mask? Am I giving up anything that's going to, make me less? Am I doing anything that's going to make me less effective for Christ? I think the answer to that is no. Not even one good argument. But then the second question might be, is there any way in which wearing a mask might help me help someone else? Does it make them feel more comfortable? Does it make them view me as someone who is not totally concerned about myself, but sees myself as part of the community, and who wants to be considerate of the community around me? So those are some questions which really stem from the question, well, what would Jesus have done?
Yes. And I think that is so key to this, because whatever great arguments you make, politically, legally, scientifically, whatever arguments you make on all this, ultimately, if God's in control and he's the one that I want to please, then what I want to say is, well, what does he have to say about this? What does Jesus do about this? And, just thinking about 1 Peter 2 in verse 13, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. And it continues on. And then at the end, verse 17, it says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. All right. So here's what our Lord has said. Well, he's in control. He's in control of all of this. So what does he ask me to do concerning the kingdoms of men and those type of things? What does he ask me to do? Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. I trust that he has this in control, and therefore I'm going to try to follow his instruction in the way that I treat my fellow man and the way that I respond to the government. And that's really, I think, the test of faith is that, do I believe that God's in control of this and that I can look to his instruction and say, okay, he says if I do it this way, that he'll be pleased with me and he'll accomplish his purposes.
Yeah, and,
Well, I
and I've
think
been
there are I'm sorry, a couple
go
of
ahead, Jeremy.
problems that come about. So Lonnie, you're talking about responding to something in the right way. Well, when we don't respond to certain things in the right way, now there can be bad repercussions. And talking about what you're reading there in 1 Peter chapter 2, I think there were some when Christians didn't respond in the right way, you were kind of open now to question. And he says specifically, for such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Now, that obviously was not in reference to wearing masks out in public, but the principle remains is that we can do things that give Christianity a black eye if we don't respond to them appropriately. So there's that one thing. There's one thing that I don't want to do. I don't want to respond to this or defend something to the death in a way that makes Christianity have a black eye. But then the other problem is not what it does to outsiders, but what does it do to brethren? And I think sometimes we can be really so defensive of our rights and our liberties that we now start putting our rights even more important. And of course, that would be a direct violation of passages like Philippians chapter 2, where he says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but for the interest of others. Have your attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. So when we don't respond appropriately to certain things, we give Christianity a black eye. Now we're in danger of, rather than encouraging others, we're biting and we're devouring. And I hear a lot of complaining going on. And that reminds me of, what Paul also wrote to in Philippians chapter 3, do all things without grumbling or disputing or without complaining. And I think there's a lot of violation of that maybe going on right now, because again, we are wholeheartedly defending our earthly citizenship, and it's causing all kinds of problems.
Yeah. So let's say that masks really is a violation of some liberty, right? That it really does affect us in a negative way. How would Jesus want us to respond to that? And the attitude, the passage that I think changed my mind on this, and the attitude that I had towards this, I was willing to submit to the mask order. I don't know the science behind it. I'm not a medical doctor or a scientist. But somebody shared it on Facebook, and then Lonnie made mention of it in his sermon. And it struck me in a way, and just I had to repent for some bad attitudes that I had had about it. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Here comes, Jesus says, a Roman soldier who commissions you to carry his satchel or his pack 1 mile. That's the context of Matthew chapter 5. Somebody bids you to go 1 mile. Roman soldiers had the right to command any citizen or any person in the Roman Empire to carry their stuff for 1 mile. Now, I can imagine how 21st century Americans would respond to that. They would say, you're putting me in slavery for 1 mile. That's a violation of my rights. That's a violation of my liberty, my God-given liberty, my life, my liberty, my pursuit of happiness. You're using that for your purposes for 1 mile. That's slavery. Well, that's a lot more inconvenient, I think, than wearing a mask, because I'm still able to go and do what I want to do. But here, this violation, maybe we would say, of a person's time, a person's liberty. And Jesus says, if they ask you to go 1 mile, you go with them too. And that if that's Jesus' attitude towards something like carrying somebody's stuff for 1 mile, then what would his attitude be towards wearing a mask? Well, if somebody asked me to wear a mask, if the government asked me to wear a mask, I need to not just be willing to begrudgingly do what I need to do, but look for ways in which I can be a benefit. Look for ways in which I can help. And I think that maybe that's an attitude that I missed. Now I want, but then on the other hand, I'm not going to wear that mask now and look down at other people who don't. Or at least I ought not, because the devil will try to get us that way too. First, he'll try to make us buck against the system and say, no, I'm not going to wear a mask. And then he'll get us to wear it and make us feel so self-righteous about wearing it that we begin to criticize other people who aren't wearing it right or who didn't bring it or whatever. And we have to be so careful, because Jesus was the master at balance and approaching things in exactly the right way. And what we need to be doing is looking at him more and more and more and following his example.
and what Jesus was presenting as a balanced view often seems like an extreme denial of self to us.
Yes.
And what that just is a challenge to the way that we think. And so we want to think like Jesus. I just want to echo what you're saying there. That's a good example. One thing that I want to say before, this is the last thing that I'll say. The idea of Christians being responsible to fight for some governmental order in which, is going to be most conducive to the preaching of the gospel. The apostles, Jesus, John the Baptist, they just never tackled those kinds of things. They never talked about the high taxes of Rome, or Rome is taking away, the rights of the people. They tried to focus on the good things. You can travel a lot more safely than you ever could because of the way Rome patrols the roads. Honor those who deserve honor. Pay your taxes because Jesus said, pay your taxes because this benefits you. I just think of one case, John the Baptist confronting Herod. Of all the things that he could have confronted Herod about, he confronted him about his personal consistency in what God had called him to be. You don't have the right to be married to the woman that you're married to. So, if we're going to interact with politicians as the people of God, it seems to me that's the example for us, that we challenge people to individually, be more submissive to God.
Yeah.
And all of this ties back into we're confident that God's in control. And so that's going to affect, Jared, I loved what you said about not grumbling and complaining, because boy, that's so easy right now. We hear so much evidence, so easy to get caught up in that. What would keep us from doing that? We're confident that God rules in the kingdoms of men, and our confidence is in him. And so all of the way we deal with these issues is shaped by the idea that we still believe that God is working things. And even though it looks like, well, what, all this is going on, that's the way it's always looked. It's always looked from man's viewpoint like things were spiraling out of control. And God continually reminds us and assures us, look, I know how things are going, and I am in control here. And our confidence in that allows us to respond very differently than the world does to these things.
And allows us to be respectful of people even when we disagree with them. That is a challenge, I know, but calling people morons and idiots and that they're evil and wicked because they have different perspectives on, especially something as simple as masks, but even more serious issues, that's not the biblically appropriate way to respond to those people. Peter says in 1 Peter 3, honor the king. Man, there's a lot of language that goes around on social media and in the news, and maybe we think we're excused because they were hateful first. That's never the way the Christian measures whether or not something's acceptable. And maybe we all have room to grow and improve in that. But we need to take that to heart. And these passages that have at certain times maybe in America's history been easier to apply because we felt like the leaders were on the same page as we are. Now when they're not, this is where the rubber meets the road in the application of some of these passages. And if we're not willing to be faithful now, what happens when there really are greater challenges, when things really are going to affect our liberties? What do we do then? Do we just now all of a sudden get our muskets and fight for a new revolution? Or do we submit to the governing authorities because they're ordained by God and because God still rules in the kingdoms of men?
Yeah. So, here's just kind of my concluding thought, I guess, as I'm listening to all of this. Me wearing a mask, having to wear a mask, being mandated by the government, that's not going to keep me out of heaven. And losing some rights or liberties, even if they're precious to me, and even if I feel like I shouldn't be losing them, that's not going to keep me out of heaven either. The loss of memorials, as bad as we hate to see them go, and as the arguments we might want to make of how important history can be and how important it is that we remember certain things, even if they're bad, so that we don't repeat, none of that's going to keep me out of heaven. But sometimes the way that I respond to and the way that I fight for my rights and liberties, the way that I want to try to hold on to something, despite what it makes me look like, despite what it do to others, those things can keep me out. And so that's what
Amen.
I would urge as we go through these difficult times where we're being challenged and we want to take some stands. And again, we're not saying that we just have to cower down and take everything and not have an opinion, not have a desire to keep our rights, but we have to keep everything in the right perspective. And the right perspective is that this world is not my home. This is not the citizenship that I'm going to fight for. What I'm going to do every day is I'm going to do something that ensures my citizenship in heaven. And sometimes that might mean taking the high road. Sometimes it might mean being quiet when I don't want to be quiet. Sometimes it might mean giving up some liberties that I don't want to give up. But there's nothing in America worth losing my soul over, whether it's the most precious right you have or not. And so that's what I would encourage you guys. It's been good to be with you, although it's probably pretty evident to those who are listening. I'm virtually there. The rest of you guys are there physically, but I'm glad technology has allowed us to be together in this capacity. And I'm really glad that technology is allowing us to reach people. And I hope that this has been beneficial to you. As always, if there is a particular subject that you would like to hear us have a discussion about, we'll be glad to do that. You can find us on Facebook, or you can reach us via email, proveallthings@mail.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Prove All Things. To suggest a topic, raise a question, or offer a comment, write to proveallthings@mail.com.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you are currently living anywhere in the world, but maybe especially in America right now, there's what seems to be a lot of chaos going on. I'm going to have to start over. I tickled Monty for some reason.
Anywhere in the world.
If you're living anywhere in
if
the
you're
world,
living anywhere.
if you're getting this podcast on the moon,
Those of you on the International Space Station, no, y'all are exempt.
You're
from
probably
this.
fine.
y'all are having a good time.
Unless the riots like somehow tear down NASA and can't get you back, then you'd be in trouble. But
I'm sorry, Jared.
right now, it's just people in the world.
It's okay. It's okay. It's really okay.
All right.
Okay. Y'all ready? Boop, boop. All right. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We are, sorry, Larson was staring at me.
You're talking.
This is awesome.
We're in the middle of a conversation.
This is a whole new world. Okay. It's just a whole new world.
This
Okay.
is awesome.
That's right.
All right. We're going to try again. All right. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Y'all remember when you decided you all wanted me to be included?
Did we?
Yeah, because
Totally.
Was that decision made?
Oh.
I'm just surprised at the level to which we are continuing. Like
I know.
Like
Yeah.
I guess I would have thought that this would not have happened.
This is going to be strictly business.
Yes. No.
and
I mean,
I was up
I think
until
this
just
is-
like
I
ready
know.
to start.
It demonstrates the extent to which this feels like we're in the same room.
That's right.
So
I'm loving it. I would not want it to be any other way. Like
That's right.
if I had
Lonnie
to do
would
any
rather
less
be a
than
different way.
Well,
can
I
tell you.
started this time, so
Yeah.
I can't really.
Okay.